Check. All right. Hello, everybody. Hello, Holsapple. We're going to go ahead and get this thing started. All right. Thanks all for coming out to this month's installment of Beer with a Scientist. My name's Levi Beverly, as usual. I see a lot of new faces here. So I'm an associate professor in the Department of Medicine. I run a cancer research lab at Louisville, U of L. I've been doing this since 2014. We've been running this Beer with a Scientist seminar series. What's going to happen tonight is we got about a 30-minute presentation. We'll have formal questions and answers afterwards, and then afterwards our speaker will hang around and answer any questions you guys might have on a one-on-one basis. A couple pieces of housekeeping information before we get going. Obviously, this is a brewery, a bar. Feel free to get up and get yourself a beverage whenever you need it. At the end of the night, please make sure you cash out your tabs if you have them. Take care of Olivia behind the bar. We've been here, some of us, maybe a couple hours. Make sure you take care of that. If you're interested in following along, we have a Facebook page. It's Louisville Underground Science. Basically, that's where I post all of the upcoming seminar series. And maybe every once in a while some interesting research that's happening in the city of Louisville. Louisville Underground Science on the Facebook. As of now, this is the last one for this calendar year. We usually do it once a month, but we'll start again in January. Will be the next talk, so check out the Facebook page. Trying to think, anything else? I think that's it for today, for this time. All right, so yeah, sometimes I forget what I need to talk about next. All right, so next we're going to go ahead and get this talk started. Today it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Jordan Hilgefort. He's been at U of L for a few years now. He came in the middle of COVID. He's an MD. He's a sports medicine guy. He's got lots of initials after his title, which I've just learned what the CAQSM is, but I already forgot about it, but I'm not going to say that. He'll tell you about it. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand the microphone over to Jordan. Give him a hand of applause, please.
Bear with me just a second. All right. Can you all hear me okay? Does that work? All right, perfect. Well, again, good evening. Thank you all for coming out. I'm Jordan Hilgefort, as you mentioned. Honored to be your speaker this evening. I first want to, before we get started, say thank you to Dr. Levi Beverly for the invitation to be here tonight, and thank you all for coming out. Also want to extend a special thank you to some friends, mentors, colleagues over here in the back as well for making it out this evening. So thank you all for being here. Give yourself a round of applause. Thank you. Hopefully you take something away from this evening and you find it informative and motivating, but at the very least, I see everybody or most people already have some beer, so at least you've got something to fall back on. Our topic for this evening is mental, physical, and nutritional factors important in prevention or in injury prevention for athletes. Before we do jump in, as Levi had mentioned, the name of the series is Beer with a Scientist, so I felt it was kind of important to at least give you a little background about myself before we start, as well as try to explain why the moniker of a scientist might be kind of loosely applicable in this case. So again, I'm Jordan Hilgefort. I have my doctorate degree, an MBA, and the CAQSM, as we were asked up here, just means Certificate of Added Qualification in Sports Medicine. So all that essentially means is that I have studied sports to some degree. So at any rate, I grew up in northern Kentucky, about an hour and a half northeast of here, a small town called Hebron. As a child, played a lot of youth sports. That's how I got involved in, I guess, athletics to start off. But soccer was really my passion. I had the opportunity to play collegiate soccer at Marshall University, where I studied biochemistry. I'll use a brief second here to give a shout out. Most people don't know where Marshall is. It's Huntington, West Virginia, or haven't heard of it. They are actually, at least right now, still the #1 ranked collegiate soccer team in the country. So, it's good for the Thundering Herd. There we go. I heard somebody back there. Thank you. But took that 4 years of undergrad and then parlayed it into another 4 years at Marshall for medical school. And that's really the first opportunity I had at that point to see what it's like on the other side of the touchline as a clinician covering sports medicine events. So graduated from medical school 2016, did my family medicine residency and later completed an MBA at Ohio State University. And to the dismay of my wife, who's sitting up here, this is Taryn. She's a huge Buckeyes fan. We met in Columbus, and after graduating residency, I went and did a fellowship at University of Michigan in sports medicine. There we go. Before then, finally landing down here in Louisville, and I joined faculty doing sports medicine and family medicine in August of 2020. So just started my 4th year here. I have the privilege of getting to work with learners at various stages of their careers, residency, medical school, fellows. I get to practice combination of sports medicine, family medicine, which I really enjoy. And I'm a team physician and part of a larger team that helps take care of a number of high school athletes as well as university athletes at the University of Louisville. So that said, part of my role as a physician is rooted in employing basic scientific principles into what I do on a daily basis. And so I would call that applied science, which essentially all it means is we're taking evidence-based treatment measures and trying to achieve a desired outcome for patients. So again, loosely speaking, there's your connection with the beer with a scientist, if you will. So although I feel like I'm still in the infancy of my career, again, a little bit into my 4th year as a full attending physician, I've studied this subject matter quite a bit. I've learned from a lot of great people that I have the privilege of working with. And I will tell you that I think that a lot of what we become as we grow up is defined and is foundational in athletics. Regardless of what career path we choose, sports helps us develop things like humility, teamwork, compassion, and ultimately those qualities make us better leaders, employees, teachers, spouses, you name it, the list goes on and on. But I do want to say that, while I work with a lot of what I would call elite level athletes at the university, what I really want to hone in on tonight and highlight is that the weekend warriors like me and you that don't necessarily have a championship to play for, but that do, have health and fitness goals that they want to pursue, these things are just as important for us as it is for, any of our athletes out on the field donning that red and black on a day-to-day basis, right? So again, I hope that this is helpful, informative, and that you take something away from it. So moving on, when we think about how we can limit injuries, I think it's first important that we talk about the scope of the problem, right? So as you might imagine, due to disparate reasons and a number of other factors, it is a challenge to figure out, well, how many and how big is this problem that we're dealing with in terms of injury, right? A lot of this goes underreported. That said, in 2022, there was a study published by the British Medical Association that estimated an annual incidence of about 322 million cases of musculoskeletal injuries per year worldwide. So that's a large number, but how do we digest that? So if you take that into context, that's about 4% of the population worldwide every year. Or if we're thinking about the people standing out here or sitting out here right now, it's about 1 in 25 of us is going to suffer a musculoskeletal injury each year. And while the severity of that might be widely variable, what we do know is those numbers tend to be even higher in our elite level athletes, upwards of about 10%. So again, I mention that because not all of us, and in fact many of us, probably never have or never will compete at that elite level. But as healthcare providers and as sports medicine providers, what we can do is take some of the research and the experience that we get and glean from caring for these athletes and be able to apply those same lessons to the greater population for all of our benefit. So with that said, I want to start from some common ground. So musculoskeletal injuries, if you think about it, are generally injuries that occur due to an overload of those musculoskeletal structures to an extent that they are unable to, let's call it, resist, if you will, the forces and the things that are placed upon them over time. So they have failure to adapt or failure to regenerate some of that tissue as we're dealing with some of the forces applied there. But even though that sounds like this is very physical in nature, there's a number of different factors that can influence, again, how we come about and how we develop those very physical musculoskeletal injuries. And those factors include, again, not only physical risk factors, but nutritional, mental risk factors as well. So without further ado, I want to jump in and we'll talk about each of these individual risk factors specifically. And so we'll start with what is likely the most familiar component we'll discuss this evening, which is the physical aspect of injury prevention. So I want to highlight and expound upon some common strategies for injury abatement. As I was making this talk, I thought to myself, I don't want to get too far into the weeds of things and try to explain things that are just going to go over our heads and we're not really going to take away. So I want to start with some high-level things and really touch on what can we be doing with those to really guard against some of the injuries that, again, set us back and take us further away from what our health and fitness goals are. So first off, I want to talk about stretching, and specifically the difference between two common modes of stretching, which are static and dynamic. So dynamic stretching aims to improve mobility, and the goal of that is to use controlled movements through a muscle's entire range of motion. So we think about this as an active movement. It usually involves mimicking the type of activity that you're getting ready to perform within exercise. So say you're gearing up for a walk, right? You want to pursue fluid stretches that warm up, say, your hip flexors, your hamstrings, some of the very things that you're about to utilize to perform the activity that you desire. So an example for, say, of a dynamic stretch that you could perform in anticipation, say, of walking would be lunging, right? So as I take one step forward, I come out, I'm engaging my hip flexors, I'm then engaging my hamstring, and I keep moving forward. And the idea behind that, again, is that we're using that motion and that range of motion to provide strength, mobility, and a full range of motion of the activity that I'm preparing to complete in longer duration. So dynamic stretching prepares your muscles and joints for exercise, again, by promoting that mobility, strengthening the muscles and joints within that range of motion. The active movement used during that dynamic stretching can also literally raise or elevate our core temperature and warm up the body. So these are motions that are better for warm up as opposed to cool down. As your blood gets pumping, you may feel some increased energy too. But that dynamic stretching is an excellent tool for also reducing what we call DOMS, or delayed onset muscle soreness. And that's that feeling of soreness that we typically get after we've pursued a hard workout that comes on in the hours to days afterwards. People often attribute that to that feeling of lactic acid and that soreness that we get. So a proper warm-up, and in particular a dynamic warm-up, can help guard against that. Boosting your circulation actually also allows for faster recovery by providing oxygen and nutrients, which results in fewer days off afterwards due to less soreness and less risk of injury. So again, you can achieve more and you can achieve a higher level of performance if we're pursuing the right warm-up. Alternatively, static stretching is a non-active form of stretching, and it involves performing a stretch without movement. So for example, bending down to touch your toes and then holding that position for a period of time. The purpose of that static stretch is to decrease stiffness in our joints after the body has been warmed up through exercise. So in addition to that, it aids in improving flexibility and the ability of that joint to, again, continue to move through that entire range of motion without pain. This type of stretching, once more, is done by holding that certain position for an extended amount of time. It should not be done before exercise, but rather is better for cool down. It helps release tension, and by using those slow and controlled movements, it's a great relaxation tool as well. So you can do this in the comfort of your own home. You can do it at the gym when you're done working out. But these types of things, again, are better for a cool down rather than a warm up. Performing those static stretches post-exercise can help reduce the risk of acute muscle strains, can also, again, just similar to the dynamic stretching, can reduce the onset of delayed onset muscle soreness. And that static stretching, again, isn't just helpful, immediately after exercise, but you can do it throughout the day. So I encourage patients, take 5 minutes throughout the day, once or twice if you can. Use this time to perform a few static stretches. And it's a great way to prevent muscle aches that generally tend to creep up as a lot of us work, for better or worse, a very sedentary lifestyle. I mean, I like to think I walk between room to room when I'm in the clinic, but for the most part, I'm sitting behind a computer desk or sitting in a chair talking to folks just like you all day long. So taking a few minutes just to stretch out, again, get those muscles and the tension released can be quite effective. So another key concept I want to discuss is overtraining and how to avoid that. So the estimates are that approximately 30% of our injuries are overuse in nature, meaning they're generally what we would call insidious in onset, which is to say that there's no one moment of injury. There's nothing you can think back to say, that's the moment where I had that happen and all of a sudden this hurts. It's kind of something that creeps up on you over time. So our bodies, as we're working out, attempt to strike this balance between our adaptive potential of our muscles, bones, ligaments, tendons, and the force and stress that we apply to those during a workout. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. But moreover, the energy demands of an intense workout, coupled with what I would call our inherent metabolic demands, meaning how much energy we need just to do the things throughout our day-to-day that keep us alive. So breathing, our brain working, cognitively thinking, all these things that you don't have to think about supplying energy for, but just happen in the background, also require energy in addition to what we go out and do through exertion. We'll discuss this a little bit further in a minute in our nutritional section, so I don't want to steal the thunder of that, but I want to mention it here too because it's applicable. So without proper consideration of our physical limitations and our individual energy demands, we put our bodies at higher risk for injury. So I often use in clinic what I call the dumbbell example. So I'll give you that example now. So imagine I had a 200-pound dumbbell in front of me on the ground here, and you said to me, all right, Jordan, I want you to pick that up and I want you to bicep curl it. So if I went down to pick that up, that 200-pound dumbbell, I'm for those that don't know, I got my coat on. I'm not that strong of a guy, right? So I grab that, I go to pick that up, and if I tried to curl that, my tendon, so the tendon is what connects our muscle to bone, my tendon would rip right off the bone. It would fail. I'm not nearly strong enough, right? Maybe there are some of you that are, but that is to say that, with enough training, you could be, right? But I'm going to change that scenario now. Now you put a 20-pound dumbbell in front of me. You put it on the ground. You said, all right, Jordan, I want you to pick that up. I want you to lift it 10, 20 times. Again, maybe you think I'm weaker than I am, but I could lift that. So 10, 20 times if I did it, I could bicep curl it. But there's going to come a point, no matter how many times you tell me to do it, there's going to come a point where I'm going to fail or fatigue, right? Now you take that and you make it a 2-pound weight, and I'm going to be able to lift it more times than I can the 20-pound weight, but even with a 2-pound weight, it might be 100 times, 200 times, I don't know, but eventually, even with a 2-pound weight, there's going to come a point where I'm not going to be able to do it anymore, right? So this example serves to drive home the point that repetitive and even submaximal force can be just as detrimental as a sudden supermaximal force, right? So if I'm lifting that 20-pound dumbbell too many times and I'm not giving my body the energy and I don't have or take into consideration the limitations that my muscles, tendons, bones, ligaments have to adapt to that force I'm applying to it, I put myself at higher risk for injury. And again, that doesn't matter if it's a 20-pound dumbbell or a 200-pound dumbbell. I have to take into account what are my own individual limitations there. So how do we combat that, and how do we think about that? And there's two principles that I want to talk about tonight that I think are fairly easy to understand, and that's the terrible twos and the 10% rule. So the terrible twos are too much, too soon, too hard, which just means our increases in frequency, duration, or intensity of exercises are to an extent that we can't, again, do what we want to do, and we have the limitations that we have that put us at increased risk for injury. And we have to thoughtfully consider and be important, or rather emphasize the importance of avoiding injury when we're trying to execute those movements. So in my opinion, we live in a society that's largely driven by this need for kind of a constant need for feedback and immediate gratification. And what I mean by that is when we go to the gym, we want to go 2 or 3 times and we look in the mirror and we want to see results, right? But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. If it did, we'd all be sitting here with, buff muscles and 6-pack abs, but that's just not reality, right? So what I try to say to people is, to put this into a sport analogy, is our goals for health and fitness, they're not a sprint, they're a marathon, right? And we have to keep that in mind as we're seeking improvements or steady improvements. We need to practice methodical, graded increases in activity that can help stave off these injuries from overtraining that we're talking about. So that's where the 10% rule comes into play. So this applies to running, and essentially it advises that you shouldn't increase your mileage by more than 10% per week. Now that rule is largely debated, and if you ask people in the running community, they might say, well, that's a little conservative, right? And so I'm not here to necessarily debate that tonight, but it's a good rule in the sense of it gives a very tangible idea of how we can guard against increasing our activity too quickly. So the 10% rule says no more than a 10% increase in what your mileage is every week. And so while there's not a direct correlate for mileage with other sports and activities, like how do I decide that if I'm Colton playing volleyball, how do I decide that too much volleyball is, when I reach this extent? That's hard to gauge, right? And so there's a little bit of an individualization factor there. But the lesson to be learned here is that we should loosely consider adhering to similar graded protocols that allow our bodies to adapt to the changes in demand that we're asking them to tolerate. Again, so I don't have specifics for you for each individual activity, but utilize that as an example to apply that to other activities that you might be interested in participating in. So now I'm going to read a quick quote here, and it says, "You can practice shooting 8 hours a day, but if your technique is wrong, then all you become is very good at shooting the wrong way. Get the fundamentals down, and the level of everything you do will rise." So that's a quote from the greatest basketball player in the history of the game, and I don't want to cause too much of an argument there, but you can derive who I'm talking about here. Exactly. So it references the importance of technique in successful task completion, and Lord knows he was one of the best at completing the task that he set out to do on a court night in and night out. So I want to wrap up this section of physical factors important in injury prevention by emphasizing the key tenets of technique and preparation. And I put a couple phrases up there for you to maybe key in on and remember, but we won't go into any specific details, as again, this varies considerably depending upon the activity being pursued. But I'll comment that our relentless desire for instant gratification and quick results often compels us to take shortcuts when exercising, bypassing proper technique and adequate preparation. So this impulsive approach can inadvertently expose us to a higher risk of injury. Again, common thread there. But by prioritizing these immediate gains over careful development, again, of strength, flexibility, and endurance, we compromise the very foundation of a safe and effective fitness program. And in some ways, that desire to push too quickly is like taking one step forward and then 2 steps back, and you end up further away from your goals in the long run anyway. So again, it's crucial to remember that the sustainable progress in physical fitness requires patience, commitment, and a focus on technique. So we're next going to touch on some nutritional factors important in injury prevention. And I am going to ask that you all bear with me on this, because for the purposes of this talk and in the interest of time, I'm going to try to pare down what is an entire discipline into about 5-ish minutes or so, okay? So if there are any dietitians, sport nutritionists, things like that out there, apologies off the bat. But nonetheless, here we go. So striking a delicate balance of key macronutrients, including carbohydrates, proteins, fat, is critical to athletic performance and recovery, and that also translates to our influence on injury risk and prevention. So when you're exercising, you need to ensure, like we talked about, that you're giving your body the energy it needs. So if you're engaging in activities which are burning a lot of energy, you need to account for this and make up for it in your diet. So carbohydrates keep your energy levels up during exercise and are the initial primary source of energy available to your body. But your muscles can only store a certain amount of carbs, stored as glycogen. So it's vital that you keep them kind of topped up and that we're making sure that we're getting adequate and appropriate carbohydrate intake. I forgot I had the microphone on the side of my face there for a second. So examples, starchy, kind of whole meal foods are great sources of carbohydrates. So wholemeal bread, whole grain rice, whole wheat pastas, for example. Protein foods supply building blocks called amino acids that help develop things like hormones, immune cells, muscle tissue, tendons, ligaments, bones, and even blood. So during exercise, the muscle protein in the areas of your body that are being worked hard, so again, in those muscles that you're working, say with that dumbbell example, those muscles break down. And protein is the primary kind of building block, if you will, that helps us repair and grow and develop those muscles. And that allows for adequate recovery, muscle adaptation, and ultimately, you guessed it, reduces our risk for injury. So great sources of protein include things like chicken, steak, fish, and eggs. And last but not least, I do want to mention here and emphasize, fats are not your enemy. So fats help cells in your body repair themselves, they reduce inflammation, they provide energy, and they keep things like bones, ligaments, and tendons lubricated to help keep your body and your movements easier. Essential fats can come from things like nuts, oils, and fish, for example. And so I want to, as we talk about this, touch on sort of the proportion of macronutrients you should be adding to your diet. And I want to start off by saying that proportion can vary based upon a few essential factors. So that's your exercise level, your weight, your age, among other things. But in general, it's recommended that you shoot for about 10 to 35% of your daily calories made up of protein, about 45 to 65% of those made up from carbohydrates, and about 20 to 35% of those made up from fats. So having in particular both carbohydrates and protein within your body about 1 to 2 hours before exercise, and then following up exercise or workout with, again, carbs and protein to replenish within about a half hour is what our recommendations are to help prevent injury. And so the key, I'll say, to combating injury risk nutritionally is ultimately reducing foods that cause inflammation and increasing foods that help reduce inflammation. So the big example I'm going to give here is that junk foods, they're generally high in refined sugars and they contribute to inflammation. So it's important to reduce those when you're considering your workout and trying to, again, minimize your injury risk. Now that's not to say you can't go have a piece of cake. I love a good dessert, after dinner just as much as the next guy, but when we have that cake, say at a birthday party, should we be eating, a slice of it every day for the next week until it's gone? That's maybe where we can cut back and make some healthy choices. So there are several kind of key vitamins, nutrients, which may aid in injury prevention as well and assist in recovery too. We'll discuss just a few of those here tonight. First, want to start by saying calcium and vitamin D, as we all, I think, kind of know at baseline, helps keep your bones strong. And ultimately what they do is they help reduce stress from injuries caused by hard workouts. You can get calcium from low-fat dairy foods like milk, cheese, and yogurt. You can get vitamin D from foods like cheese, egg yolk, and fatty fish. You can also consider just supplementing with these, and they're available over the counter at just about any drugstore you go to. Vitamin C and E provide antioxidants, and these help to prevent damage to cells in your body. So antioxidants specifically inhibit inflammation. Again, we talked about trying to reduce inflammation as a way within our diet to prevent injury. And so what happens when you have this state of inflammation, your body releases what are called free radicals. And these free radicals, in a sense, put you at higher risk for injury because they're toxic waste products that sort of compound the effects of that inflammation. So vitamin C and E in particular are high in antioxidants and help with things like wound repair and regeneration of some of that tissue that breaks down on a cellular level during a workout. So best sources of vitamin C are fruits, mainly things like oranges, as well as fruiting vegetables, so think tomatoes and sweet peppers. Great sources of vitamin E are vegetable oils, so things like sunflower oil, olive oils, non-citrus fruits, nuts, and seeds. And the last one I'll talk about here is that it's vital to get enough iron in your diet, especially during kind of the recovery phase of a workout. So iron helps our body produce blood cells and collagen. So collagen at, again, a microscopic level is essentially the glue that kind of holds our body together. So it's present in a number of different sources or a number of different areas in the body, from, again, tendons to ligaments to muscles to bone. And it helps, again, improve, if you will, the ability of our body to resist the forces, again, that we're trying to put on those as we're also trying to adapt our muscles to become stronger, or as we're trying to improve mobility and motion. So consequently, because iron, again, contains a lot of this collagen, and it's also helpful with immune cells and our immunity, you can see that it's important as a repair protein to then help guard against our injury risk. So things that are high in iron, or foods high in iron, are red meat, eggs, fish, and then if you're vegetarian or vegan, your leafy greens, so things like spinach in particular. And so the last kind of thing we'll hit on here from a nutrition standpoint is hydration. So adequate hydration is essential during exercise, plays a pivotal role in preventing a wide range of injuries, musculoskeletal and metabolic, and we'll touch on those here. But it's recommended to drink water, again, before, during, and after exercise. So before exercise, usually advise patients drink around 16 to 24 ounces or fluid ounces of water, and you want to do that about 2 hours before a workout. So if you think about, and I'm looking, and I don't think anybody has one, but those plastic water bottles are around 16 ounces. So that's kind of the minimum of what you should be shooting for, again, about 2 hours before activity. You should be trying to consume about 7 to 10 fluid ounces, or roughly speaking, we'll say half of one of those water bottles for every 10 to 20 minutes that you're active during exercise. That can vary depending upon a number of factors. So again, your body size, the intensity of the exercise, and your environmental conditions, right? So if I went out and ran a mile right now, I'm probably not going to need to hydrate quite as much as I would if it were the middle of July here when it was 95 degrees. Now, if you want to be really empirical about that, you say, okay, Jordan, well, you're giving me these numbers, but how do I really nail down on that? What you can do, and what a lot of our athletes do with some help, is they record their weight both before and after training, and they dedicate and hydrate, particularly based upon weight loss. And so this is especially important with certain environmental conditions. So when it's hot and humid, or when it's extremely cold, for individuals with a high sweat rate, as well as in high altitude environments, you tend to increase your rate of water loss during exertion in those environments in particular. So we recommend that athletes replace about 1 pound of weight loss. So again, if you take your weight before and you take your weight after, for every pound of weight that you lose, you want to supplement with about 16 to 24 ounces of water. So again, the bare minimum would be if I go out and run, I step on the scale, I take my weight beforehand, and I'm 170 pounds, I go out and run, I come back from running, I'm going to go hop in the shower. Before I do that, I take my weight, and now I'm 168 pounds. Well, I'm down essentially 2 of those plastic water bottles. And so what we advise athletes to do is try to consume most of that water to replenish our body within about 2 hours of exercise, but the goal is to have all of that consumed and replenished within about 6 hours post-training. So again, that's sort of the musculoskeletal side of things. And I'll tell you, proper hydration, again, supports injury prevention by maintaining that muscle function and flexibility. We know that dehydration can lead to muscle cramps and put you at higher risk for strains, making you more vulnerable, again, to those musculoskeletal injuries. So additionally, though, staying well hydrated is crucial in reducing what I would call metabolic injuries. And those things include like heat exhaustion, heat stroke, or a kidney problem called rhabdomyolysis. So these conditions, again, are more likely to occur in a dehydrated state, as adequate fluid levels, again, not only help keep us hydrated, but they also help regulate our core body temperature and flush waste products out of our body. So to ensure proper hydration, it's not only important for peak athletic performance, but it helps safeguard our overall health during physical activity. All right, so the last of our 3 factors we're going to touch base on here is the mental health side of things. And admittedly, I would count this as probably the area we know least about in terms of its weight and its magnitude, about how much of that is allocated towards injury prevention. But what we do know that we maybe didn't emphasize as much, throughout the past, I'd say 5 to 10 or more years, is that this is absolutely an important factor in reducing, again, the very physical musculoskeletal injuries that we can encounter. And we're going to talk about that here. There we go. So some physiological research has shown that sports injuries are attributable to a number of mental health factors, if I can speak appropriately here. So emotional state, our coping resources, our social support, our perceived vulnerability, our personalities, and our risk-taking behaviors can all influence our injury risk. So there's a stress injury model that a couple of psychologists named Anderson and Williams first developed in 1988, and this seems quite obvious, but we're going to break this down. And essentially what they said was that when athletes experience a stressful situation, they react with a stress response. So increases in stress are likely to be associated with narrowing attention, greater distractibility, and higher levels of muscle tension. Again, just from the stress that we perceive in our environment. So this suggests that these stressful events affect an athlete's performance, which can ultimately increase their risk of sport injuries. So what extent an athlete experiences stress depends largely upon kind of the first 2 things on the right side here, our personality and our coping resources. And so I put this image up here to say that it's a balance, right? All of us perceive stress, but how we manage that and the effects of that stress really dictate to what degree our injury risk is predicated by our activity. So to cite some literature, there was a pioneering study performed by these 2 gentlemen I mentioned in 1988 that showed that sports injury prevention through crisis interventions reduced the risks of sports injuries as well as increased the overall reported self-confidence of athletes at the 1988 Olympics. So again, I'll repeat that behavioral health interventions actually reduce the overall number of musculoskeletal injuries in Olympic athletes in 1988. And that was fairly novel at that time. So then a smaller study kind of following that, looking at elite gymnasts, found that stress management interventions significantly reduced injuries in addition to stress levels. So we followed this up saying, okay, well, we have this new kind of novel idea that this stress response might actually dictate some of our physical injuries. And then there are studies that kind of corroborate that moving forward. So those are kind of old studies. So I looked to see, well, what do we have, present day? And so there's a recent meta-analysis that examined the effects of psychological intervention on prevention of sports injuries. And what that revealed is that preventative measures that focused on some of the things on the right here, so stress management, cognitive behavioral therapy, muscle relaxation, and attention training actually, again, improved self-confidence and reduced overall injury risk. And that was here in 2022.
All right, let's see if we can. Screen.
That's all right. So I'm almost done anyway. So here we are.
That's right. The battery is done anyway. Hey, you get.
We'll make it.
No.
No. That's all right. I can project. We're good. So I would categorize these things again on the right side of our balance beam here into develop techniques to combat those stress reactions that otherwise put us at risk. Again, those stress reactions causing that narrowing attention, the distractibility, and increased muscle tension. The coping mechanisms that we would develop are largely what I would call adaptive resilience, meaning they are trained resilience techniques to help reduce injury that are significantly geared towards our mental health. And that's become a key component in our injury risk reduction. So to wrap up, this is my last one here, so I appreciate you bearing with me. I wanted to provide a practical example of a condition resulting from this confluence of all 3 of those factors we talked about. So again, the physical, the nutritional, and the mental factor in injury prevention, and discuss our approach to management of this condition using a multidisciplinary team. So again, a very practical, real-life example. So there's a condition that we treat that's called relative energy deficiency in sport, or RED-S, what I've designated up there. And essentially what this is it's a constellation of somatic symptoms, so very physical symptoms, that's triggered at its core by a nutritional deficiency. But that nutritional deficiency is then predicated by disordered eating, which is oftentimes the result of a mental health condition. So you can see how some of these things are actually interconnected and layered upon each other. And so essentially what happens is there's an imbalance of energy expenditure and energy intake that causes this overall energy deficit. And because of that, our hormone levels drop. And when hormone levels drop, in those of us that menstruate, we can have inactive menstrual cycles, so where the menstrual cycles become absent, or at the very least become irregular. And when we look at sort of our bony architecture, when we do studies and things what we call DEXA scans, our bones actually become more porous and our fracture risk goes up. And so unfortunately in these situations, oftentimes we are detecting this condition after athletes have already developed a fracture. So they walk into the office, they're having pain, they have a fracture, and when we start asking questions about things that might put them at risk for that, we uncover all of these other things that are layered in that. So our management, again, as you might imagine, involves treating that fracture, treating that pain, and improving our bone mineral density. But this involves a multidisciplinary team, again, to make sure that we're preventing similar injuries in the future. And so at the University of Louisville, we're fortunate to have access to experts in a number of different fields. So we have expert mental health and mental performance coaches who are knowledgeable about the type of disorders like body dysmorphia that causes patients to perceive their physical appearance as not what they want and ultimately lead to disordered eating. That's one example of a number, but these individuals are experts in helping to manage some of those expectations and helping to manage, again, the mental health conditions that then lead into the nutritional deficiencies. So later on top of that, we have sports nutritionists who help athletes develop appropriate eating patterns and appropriate nutritional intake to make sure that we're providing the body the nutrition and the sources of energy it needs to be able to, again, adapt to the forces that we're putting upon it. And last, when we talk about a treatment plan, we have a number of athletic trainers, physical therapists, strength and performance coaches, and a number of other health experts that I'm probably leaving out here that help us guide that return to play protocol so that we make sure that we're leading athletes down a safe path to return, and then ultimately we're preventing issues like this in the future. So this example really epitomizes sort of the culmination of all three of those things coming together in concert to address resolution of a complex medical disorder like this. Again, this is very practical and real, and we run across this all the time. But my hope is that with further emphasis on some of these preventative measures we've talked about this evening, that ideally we can preclude injuries like this, as well as many others, from happening in the future altogether. Again, thanks for
All right, I've got the microphone issue. We just had to scream if there's any questions. I'm going to start off with the first one to get us going. So I'm really curious about the overuse injuries, especially as it pertains now to young athletes doing the same sport all year long. So, now it seems like young athletes have to specialize when they're 6 years old. They have to play that sport all year long, but when we were growing up, you played each sport in its season. So, are you seeing a lot of more overuse injuries because of that specialization, and how can the athletes especially overcome that if it's an issue?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I guess I'll start from the end and work back there. So to answer the last question, it is an issue. It is a hot button topic in sports medicine right now. We call it early youth sports specialization. Essentially all that means is exactly what Dr. Beverly mentioned, that a lot of our young set of movements. So what our recommendations generally are is that you're giving your body at least a period of about 3 to 4 months off of that same activity over the course of a year. So the best evidence that we have says that if we can reduce that down to 8 to 9 months to give ourselves an adequate break, it largely reduces the potential injury risk that we're putting ourselves at in the future. I may piggyback a little bit because we do have some very knowledgeable physical therapists sitting at the table back here. So if you don't mind, in a second, I'll let them give their 2 cents on this as well.
Oh, that's great. No,
open
punt
this
it.
up,
Punt the question. If somebody else has some information, I think everybody would love to hear it. I mean,
but suffice to say, what I will say is that every major sports medicine conference I've been to in the last 5 years, that is a topic that's being discussed endlessly. And the real debate around that is we certainly understand that specializing in one area and just doing one thing that puts an undue amount of stress on our bodies does put you at higher risk for injury. And we've seen that, particularly overuse injuries. However, the argument is, well, how do I get adept or superior at one particular sport compared to my colleagues and peers if I am taking time away from that when others might be spending all their time doing that one thing? And what the data, the limited data, because we're still learning a lot, but what the data would show us is that, again, it's that couple things. It's that 1 step forward, 2 steps back type of mentality that, well, if I'm pursuing something to the detriment of my body and I ultimately suffer an injury, I might actually be taking more steps backwards than I would have if I had just given myself a chance to rest. On top of that, what we found through data is that actually the majority of sports, where you look at the elite level athletes or the professional athletes, the majority of the sports that we've done retrospective studies on actually show that the athletes that are multi-sport athletes are the ones that achieve that higher level. And again, the reasoning behind that maybe isn't fully understood. You could postulate why that might be. But the caveat that I will give to that is it's very sport dependent too, right? So we were discussing ahead of time, and I would tell you, if you watch the Olympics coming up in 2024 in Paris, in gymnastics, you're going to see that likely our best gymnasts are probably going to be, outside of maybe Simone Biles, are going to be those like 14, 16, 18-year-old gymnasts. So the argument there is, well, how do I become an Olympic elite level gymnast if I'm taking time away while every other gymnast is practicing 6-7 days a week and only doing that at the detriment of every other sport? And what I would tell you is that's maybe a poignant exception to the rule, but on the whole, generally speaking, the majority of our professional athletes in other domains, so football, soccer, basketball, hockey, baseball, are multi-sport athletes. So take that for what you will, and I'll again, call on some other experts here.
Can I ask a follow-up for the brain trust?
Yeah, absolutely, please.
The follow-up for the brain trust as well is, are there some sports that are more prone than others to being problematic for year-round training?
I would say the answer
repeat
is...
the question. Repeat the question.
Yeah, so the question was, and you let me know if I'm putting words in your mouth, are there sports that are more prone to those overuse injuries through year-round training than others?
Yes.
And the answer is yes, and I will tell you that it's hard to quantify that risk, but there are some that we see maybe more often than others, but it's also somewhat position dependent within those sports. So I'm going to give you an example. Baseball, exactly.
Okay.
Pitchers, but not just pitchers, but it's important, and this is something I counsel our youth baseball players on, pitchers and catchers. So the one thing you don't want to do is be a pitcher and a catcher for the same team. Because for every ball you throw as a pitcher, there's a ball that the catcher gets and throws right back to the pitcher, right? So if we're trying to monitor pitch counts, for instance, trying to reduce shoulder and elbow injuries in our pitchers, the last thing we want to do is have you go out and throw 100 plus pitches. You come out and now you're in a catcher, and what are you doing? You're throwing that ball back to somebody else or gunning somebody down at second, where you're putting that same stress on the arm. To be direct with that though, soccer is a big one. I can tell you that from personal experience as well as my involvement in soccer. Basketball, tennis is another one. I don't know.
I can hear running, so we must be okay with running. Right?
Yeah. So can I give a quick caveat on running? There's actually there's actually a lot of consternation around like, well, if I run, do I put myself at increased risk for not only overuse injuries, but the long-term thing with arthritis, for instance. And there have been a lot of studies here recently that would actually suggest your risk for arthritis or these types of injuries with running are greatest when you are, ultra runners. So I would say if you are regularly doing marathons, or if you're sedentary and you're not doing any running. The people that generally tend to have the most joint health long term, what we're finding, is the people that are active on a routine basis. So again, take that for what you will, but what that means is, should we be off the couch pursuing some type of physical activity? Absolutely. That's not to your detriment for joint health long term. Now, if you're doing ultra marathons or you are training and you're putting in high mileage all the time, then you're probably at that level where maybe that's going to catch up to you.
So children, 30 miles a week, is that 20 to 30 miles a week?
What's the children? What's the children though? Like, you talking 10 years old? I mean, that's important, right?
So great question. There's a couple things I would factor into that. One, I'd say it's individual dependent. It's hard to give you a set number on that. What is a lot for instance, what's a lot for me is probably not a lot for you, and may not be a lot for others. As far as kids go, I typically don't have a set number that I will tell kids, hey, you can't run more than X miles a week, or you can't run more than X miles a day. But what we really look at is, are you providing yourself enough opportunity to overcome any soreness, aches, pains, things that you're developing? Because that's really your body's way of saying, I'm pushing too hard. And that comes in two ways. One, that's discomfort. We know with kids in particular, they have open growth plates. And the growth plates tend to be the point of weak, basically the weak point in our bodies. And so that's where they generally will develop most of their injuries. But the second part of that is to say that, again, your body's going to tell you when you're pushing it too hard. And what's important there is that we listen to our body, we back off, allow ourselves to achieve that rest, and then we try to pursue, again, that 10% model, or close to thereof, in terms of graded, methodical approaches to increasing that level of activity. So again, I know that's very vague, but
you run the 30 miles as long as you're not pitching and catching at the same time. That's what I do.
there you go. Yeah.
So we know about the huge phenomenon of pickleball.
Yep.
Let's address the white elephant in the room. What kind of injuries and the increase of injuries related to that sport are you seeing, and how can the weekend warriors kind of prevent those garden variety injuries that are happening playing pickleball?
Yeah. So this might also be a great question for that, but I'm going to answer you first. Low back, number one. And the second part to your question, how do we guard against that? I would say is making sure that when we're jumping into an activity like that we're being mindful of our own limitations. So I'm going to give you a real world example. My parents never heard of pickleball, never played pickleball until about 6 weeks ago. Love it. Love it. The other night my mom calls me up.
I'm sure you're thirsty by now.
My mom calls me up and says, you know what, like, we're playing and we're just going out and playing 3 hours a night now on Mondays, and then increasing. And originally they started with a 45-minute, back and forth. And I said, Mom, what are you doing? She said, well, yeah, I can't understand why my legs hurt, my back's sore. I said, well, you went from doing 45 minutes of activity to jumping into 3 hours of pickleball, and you can barely get off the out of bed the next morning because it bothers you so much. And again, that's an extreme example, but the point there again, and the hallmark of, I guess, what I would say with this, is it's a graded increase in that level of activity. Specific to something like pickleball or anything, I occasionally cover field hockey at Louisville, and I don't know how those girls run around like this for 60 minutes with their backs. But again, if I tried to do that for 10 or 15 minutes at a time, I'd come limping off the field because of back soreness. So I think part of that is understanding what activity are you seeking to pursue, and trying to develop contingencies around how do I understand what are the common injuries there that I need to avoid, and how do I maybe strengthen and slowly move into that activity to avoid those types of injuries. So again, specifically for things like back pain, I would tell you strengthen at the back, but also there's emphasis on the core, hip flexor flexibility, our abductors or the muscles here in our butt. Emphasizing those things can ultimately help prevent stress and injuries to the back. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, cool, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so my question is about basically can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically you're talking about the stretching the environmental goals. So in the military, training to stretching to you can't stretch as like rubber band pops the muscles and then it's like run. So what did you suggest?
Repeat that one more time.
Okay, so they did it like a rubber. You know how a rubber band is when it's cold. So then they're like, okay, just run and don't stretch out. So what is your take on that? As far as the stretching and cold.
When it's cold. So I would argue when it's cold is probably
Repeat the question.
yeah. So if I'm not understanding your question correctly, correct me. But basically, I think the key part of what you're asking is when it's cold or in any environmental condition, is there a time when maybe stretching before your activity is not a good idea? Is that correct? That's correct. Okay. What I would say, or I guess how I would respond to that is, I would say that stretching, in particular dynamic stretching, is important before any activity or exercise or workout that you're doing, in the sense that it prepares those muscles that you're about to put under stress for the movement that you're trying to do, and it helps improve the flexibility and warm up those muscles so that you're not just going from a cold state to now all of a sudden I'm trying to pursue that particular activity. So in your example in particular, if it's cold outside and I step out of the car at the park and the first thing I do is take off running, well, now all of a sudden I'm asking all my muscles, my hamstrings, my quads, my hips, everything here to now go through a motion in real time that I haven't quite prepared that to do. And so what's important in that example and in the one I gave, potentially doing just some light lunges. So in a controlled manner, putting those muscles through the range of motion that you're about to ask them to perform, but doing it in such a way that you're not immediately jumping right into what you're doing is going to help warm up those muscles. And even as we talked about, will help physically warm up those muscles in terms of increasing temperature, such that the elasticity, things like that, are going to be greatly improved, and you help reduce ultimately the risk of injury. So I guess to boil that down, because that got a little bit long-winded there, and that's how I tend to be on some of this stuff, but I would argue that a dynamic warm-up is important for any activity that you're about to pursue. And I'll tell you that out on our athletic campus over at the university, we have strength and performance coaches who one of their important jobs is before any of our teams go out and start warming up, the first thing they do is they get with our strength and performance team and they go out and go through a dynamic warm-up, usually about 5 to 10 minutes before they get into full activity. Does that answer?
I'm going to ask one more question, and then everybody can come up and ask as many questions they want. Because I organize this thing, I get the privilege of asking the last question. So, one thing you said was about the water, the amount of water you should drink. And so, what we always go back and forth about is, when do you do water? When do you do electrolytes? So, liquid IV or Noon or LMNT. So, when do you decide to do water versus hardcore electrolytes?
Yeah. So good question. This is going to be a little bit long-winded, but bear with me here. So before exercise, the most important thing that you're doing is hydration, and I would argue that the carbohydrates, the energy that you need for the activity you're about to pursue should come from your diet. So it should come from what you're eating. In terms of rehydration, so hydration both during and after activity, probably the easiest way that I would describe this for the vast majority of us is the difference between hydrating with, say, water and a sports drink. So call it Gatorade, Powerade, or things like Pedialyte, Liquid IV. Those things provide a lot of electrolytes. They provide a lot of carbs through sugar, as well as a number of other things. Generally speaking, unless you are pursuing a very vigorous activity, and I'm going to give you kind of a standard number here, and some might debate me on this, but if you look at
the literature, this is kind of a good way to delineate. If you are exercising for less than an hour, you likely do not need a sports drink, a Gatorade, a Powerade, something like that. You're not going to deplete enough of your energy source and carbohydrates to need to replenish with Gatorade. They have a great marketing team, so they're going to tell you that, yes, Gatorade, that's the fuel for athletes, right? And I'm not saying there's not a time and a place for that, but in terms of your own hydration, those needs, hydrating with water before and during activity up to an hour's duration is probably adequate for all of us here. Now, if you're pursuing more intense exercise, if you're pursuing exercise that spans beyond an hour, then you need to start thinking about, I have to rehydrate and also replenish some of those electrolytes and those energy stores that I'm losing during activity. And that's the point where not only hydrating with something like a Gatorade, a Powerade, or Pedialyte might be important, but also considering trying to consume some type of food either during a break or even sometimes during exercise. So again, our group back here might be able to give me a little information on this, but I've never actually run long enough to have to worry about eating a slice of pizza or something while I'm running. But you see these marathon runners at times who are mid-run and somebody's coming in and handing them a box of pizza. And they're sitting there chowing down on a slice of pizza or something while they're continuing to run, right? And so you're replenishing some of those energy stores that, for the vast majority of us, we don't necessarily have to worry about.
All right, let's give Jordan one more round of applause. Again, sorry for the microphone. I will make sure I have AA batteries in my pocket next time. Make sure you cash out if you have a tab open and live. Come on up and ask Jordan questions until midnight if you want. Thank you. See you guys next time.
Thank you all. I'm sorry I didn't get to
Yes, good to see you. Let's all get together instead of coming here afterwards, we'll just sit here and talk.
it.